Hello, and welcome to UnKpopular Opinions, a safe space for fans of BTS and other K-pop groups to ask the tough question, what do I think of this? I'm your host, Ginger Nuna, and today I'm going to be sharing my origin story, how I found K-pop, and what drove me to make this podcast in the first place. I think I want to start with a little bit more about me. I'm pretty sure that you've guessed my real name is not Ginger Nuna. I chose the pseudonym Ginger Nuna because I'm an older K-pop fan and I have red hair. It was pretty easy to come up with it. The reason that I use a pseudonym instead of my real name, there are a couple of reasons why I do that. The first reason is fear, honestly. I have always been really good about expressing my opinions, but when it comes to sticking by my opinions and what I've said in terms of talking with people that aren't my friends or my family, I have a really hard time standing by what I said, even though it is what I believe. I am such a people pleaser that I can start to question everything that I said. Another reason that I chose to go with a pseudonym is because Ginger Nuna is my persona. There are definite aspects of my real self, but I would say that Ginger is a lot braver than I am. I think Ginger is kind of my Sasha Fierce. A little bit more about me. I grew up during what I would call the boy band renaissance. There were definitely boy bands before, and there were boy bands after, but this period in the late 90s, early 2000s, I would say everyone would agree, at least in the United States, was the boy band renaissance. The two biggest groups were Backstreet Boys and NSYNC, but boy bands were such a hot thing that that's what everyone was trying to do. That's what early reality TV shows were. There was a show called Making the Band that ran for several seasons where the goal was to make a new boy band because boy bands were just what was in. My first concert that I ever went to was a Backstreet Boys concert. I loved the Backstreet Boys. I had a poster of them in my room. I didn't have the parasocial relationship that I have with BTS. I just thought they were cute and really liked their music. But it wasn't, anything where I felt like I knew the members or really cared about the members more than I would just care about a random person. Really, my first big love, music-wise, was Hanson. For those of you who don't know, Hanson is a band made of three brothers. They are often considered one-hit wonders. They had a song in 1997 called Mbop, and it's super catchy. And the lyrics are deceptively thought-provoking, especially when you consider that when Hanson became big, the members were 11, 14, and 17. So it was a really big thing that they were all kids. They were kids who wrote their own music and played their own music. So they got labeled as a boy band, but in traditional terms, they weren't a boy band. Boy bands, at least in American boy bands, were typically very manufactured, brought together by a company. They sang other people's songs, at least in the beginning, and they danced. And Hanson doesn't dance. Hanson writes all their own music. They always have. And I just adored them. They were my absolute favorite band for 23 years. I grew up in a pretty small town in the middle of nowhere, and in order to see Hanson, I would have to drive for hours and hours, and sometimes I would go up to Canada. Sometimes I would go down to Los Angeles. I had to drive all over the place to see them. I didn't get to see them for the first time until I was in college, just because it was so hard to go to a concert. I was so attached to them and their music that the only tattoo I have ever seriously considered getting in my life is the Hanson symbol on the inside of my right wrist. That is really the only tattoo I've ever thought of getting. And I loved them. I loved them so much. In my small town, boy bands weren't popular, but Hanson especially wasn't popular. You would never hear any of their music on the radio. I got made fun of a lot for liking them. And I think that's something that you'll hear from a lot of Hanson fans, is that we got a lot of shit growing up because bop sounds so simple and bubblegum, and people don't take the time to listen to the lyrics, and people don't take the time to consider that they were so young and doing all the aspects of their music, the writing, the playing of the instruments. They really are very talented. And I wouldn't call them one-hit wonders because they've been consistently making music for 23 years, 24 years. Wow, yeah, it's been 24 years since Middle of Nowhere came out. But you're going to notice, especially if you are listening to the Spotify edition, there isn't any Hanson music on this episode. And I'm going to explain a little bit later why there isn't any music and why I keep saying that I loved them in the past tense. It's said you find BTS when you need them. And I think it's true. The very first time that I saw BTS was when they did Boy with Love on Stephen Colbert, and I wasn't impressed. The reason I wasn't impressed was Jimin. Jimin's start in that performance was really weak. I have a really hard time getting into a performance if the very beginning isn't great. It's just something that's always been that way for me. I grew up doing musical theater, and when you do musical theater, you have to sing and dance at the same time. And so to start that performance with Jimin being kind of warbly and being able to hear his backing track, that didn't impress me. And I didn't rebound from that. In retrospect, I was being my very opinionated self. And because I'm so opinionated, I have a hard time giving grace to people. It's easy for me to forget that people are humans, even professionals, especially professionals. And now that I've watched BTS, I know that that was a one-off, that Jimin doesn't usually start the song like that. But when I saw it, because he started in such a vocally weak place without having done any dance moves to begin, I just thought, I don't get the hype. I don't get why these adults are singing a song called Boy with Love. It just wasn't something I was interested in. So I watched it, wasn't impressed, moved on with my life. Well, let's flash forward a little bit. February 28th, 2020 is what I call my Armyversary. It's the day that I really discovered BTS and really became invested in who they are. It was random. Carpool karaoke was being advertised all over the place in terms of people doing reactions on YouTube, articles being written that I would see on IMDb. And I was curious. I was curious why everyone was losing their minds about this carpool karaoke segment. I'd never even seen carpool karaoke before, to be honest. And the first time I watched it, I fell in love. I was smitten with Namjoon, his ability to converse with James Corden and his swagger. And my first bias, oddly enough, was Jimin. And because I really hadn't paid attention to who was who during Boy With Love and didn't know anybody, I didn't know until I rewatched the performance later as a BTS fan. Oh, my bias is the one who started out this whole debacle where I didn't initially like this group. I really like Jimin. I loved blonde Nutcracker Prince Jimin. I just adored him. Now you know that my co-biases are Yoongi and Hobie. I think the reason I wasn't drawn to them immediately was Yoongi. Yoongi was hilarious, but his camera angles were a hate crime. Like, his camera angles were so bad. Really, the only people who looked legitimately handsome during Carpool Karaoke were Namjoon and Jimin. Everybody else, it just kind of got a little worse, and then poor Yoongi was stuck in the bitch seat in the back and had the worst camera angles. After watching Carpool Karaoke, I think YouTube must have recommended their performance of on Jimmy Fallon in Grand Central Station. And I watched that, and that's when I was hooked. That's when I realized I had underestimated these men. Because On was the first performance that I watched intentionally looking for BTS and a performance. And I can't describe the feeling that I had. I was in awe. The musical theater side of me was in awe. I could tell, of course there's a backing track, but to be performing like that in a place where the acoustics are terrible, I was enamored. And it was the perfect time to find this group. COVID had started, and it hadn't really reached the United States yet. It was getting there. We might have had a few cases, but we weren't having the widespread fear. I found BTS and really just fell down the rabbit hole. It's, of course, started with I just want to know their names. And so the first ones I learned were Namjoon's and Jimin's. And it just progressed from there. And then the following weekend, I had a girls' trip with Sam, who you met in episode 10, and our friend Kat. And I said, you need to watch this. You need to watch Carpool Karaoke, and you need to watch this performance. And Sam and Kat agreed to watch that for me because they love me. And Sam really liked it. So the outside world was slogging on, but I had this new thing in my life that made me feel alive, that made me feel energized. Honestly, I hadn't felt this excited about anything since Hanson. And 23 years is a really long time to go without a huge spark. And it was wonderful. It was euphoric, if I'm being honest. The first album that I bought was Map of the Soul 7, and I bought that one because it was the only one that wasn't on Amazon Music, and I was able to stream all the other ones for free, so I thought, okay, especially if I want to listen to this On song, I should go ahead and buy this album. And I really loved that album. And that album got me through some hard stuff. So, like I mentioned before, I grew up doing musical theater, and that's something that I have continued doing throughout my adult life. It was my hobby. When I decided to try to have a kid, I stopped doing musical theater, just to really focus on getting pregnant, because some people already know this, but in case you don't, it doesn't always just happen right away, especially when you're in your 30s. It sometimes takes a little while. So I was really focused on that. And then after I was lucky enough to give birth, I had a young child, and I didn't have the support system in place or the financial means to be able to have a social life, because in order to have the time to do musical theater, you would basically either need a babysitter or you need your partner to stay home all the time and you'd never see your kid. And that didn't work well for me, especially with working full time. Finally, my kid was old enough that I felt confident that this was a good time to start auditioning for stuff again. And I was so excited because I was cast in my first show, and it had been almost 3 years. Yeah, it had been almost 3 years when I was cast in that show. And the roundabout reason why I'm talking about this is I was supposed to start rehearsals at the end of March. And we got to our first rehearsal. And during that rehearsal, that's when we heard our state was shutting down. And so my show was canceled. And I had this really deep connection to BTS because you're going to have a deep connection when you drive home down the interstate, scream crying Inner Child and 0 o'clock and all of these songs that are helping you get through these feelings. And they help me feel better. A couple of days later, I got laid off. So now I found myself with all of this free time on my hands. And you know what? It ended up not being terrible. After I was laid off, whenever I had a chance, I got to spend more time falling down the BTS rabbit hole. I spent hours listening to every single one of their songs and reading translations of the lyrics. Just like I think a lot of ARMY, Paradise really was such a healing song for me. It was a healing song because I was in limbo with my job, but also because I had a job. I didn't have a career. I don't have a career. I don't think I will ever have a career. And that's not something I was prepared for growing up. Growing up, you're told one day you're going to have a job and that job will become your career. And that's just not how it worked out for me. It was so nice to almost have this permission to stop running, to just be okay with what I had. I was so incredibly fortunate because the place that laid me off rehired me in May. And I would spend early Sunday mornings when my kid was asleep watching translations of Yoongi's Honey FM radio show and just feeling comforted. I felt a lot less alone, not only just by listening to their music, but by sharing all of this with Sam. Sam and I met when we worked together, and we started working together about, oh my gosh, it's been 5 years. Yeah, the first thing we bonded over was the Summer Olympics and how much we hated Ryan Lochte. So time moved on, and because I'm not a career person, I ended up leaving. And Sam has stayed with the company, and it has become her career. And we had things to talk about, but having BTS has brought us so much closer together. And I felt so much less alone because I had this to share with her. I had someone who understood. It wasn't like when I loved Hanson, where I was the only person I knew who loved Hanson. I'm usually pretty hesitant to reach out to people online. I'm not great at making friends. And having a real life friend who would spend every Wednesday with me watching Run BTS, that was a really big thing that helped me get through the beginning of COVID. And after finding BTS, I ended up following TXT because I feel like that's a pretty natural progression. After that, I saw that Big Hit was going to be doing a reality series, and that's how I found UnHypen. And I found all these other great groups just because YouTube suggested them and other people online were talking about them. I found Luna from one of my listeners, Bug, suggested them. And I love them. They're so great. I can't tell you who's in it because there are 12 of them, but their music is great. I found Stray Kids because of an elderly meme. Her animations that she does almost on a daily basis, she does them on, I think it's TikTok, maybe it's Instagram, but she also uploads it onto her Twitter. And they're so funny. Casey is just such a great artist. And her love of Stray Kids made me want to check out Stray Kids. I followed UnHypen, which made me interested in following other new rookie groups. And I was fortunate enough that some of the people that I loved from Island who didn't make it into UnHypen were debuting later. Ganu debuted with Just Be, and I love Just Be's music. And I randomly came across UA. I don't know why UA isn't popular with everyone. I love Blackpink. I think it's really interesting when there are fandom wars. I think it's probably a product of my age that I don't quite understand it. I do understand being devoted, but I don't understand the aspect of hating other groups. But those are all groups that really brought me great amounts of joy. In a teaser for UnKpopular Opinions, I did an introduction to why I was having a podcast. And it was a short introduction, and I'd like to explain a little bit more why I decided to make a podcast. The first reason I made a podcast was because I was having a hard time finding older BTS fans. I know now that there are a lot of us, but at the time I felt really alone, and I wanted to make a podcast for older BTS fans. And funnily enough, while I was brainstorming this, I came across an op-ed by Virginia Dwan. And Virginia also had a podcast. Her podcast, the Nuna Army podcast, was what I wanted my podcast to be. And I felt like, well, I shouldn't make a podcast because Virginia's here. Virginia is 42. She has 4 kids. She has a career. She basically has my life to an extreme. So what could I say that she hasn't said? And Virginia is Asian American. I believe she's first generation. And even though she's not Korean, she's Chinese. She knows more about Asian culture and had this insight that I couldn't provide as a white woman, and I shouldn't try to provide as a white woman. But in one of Virginia's later episodes, she said something about everybody has their own story to tell. And I realized even though there were a lot of parallels between my story and Virginia's, it's not the same story. I've mentioned offhandedly in the podcast that I am also a person with a disability. I don't think I've mentioned, but I am a fat person. I have all these aspects of my life that can influence how I take in popular culture. Another thing that I really enjoyed when I first found BTS was watching reaction videos. I could not get enough of reaction videos. And then, all of a sudden, I could. Because the majority of reaction videos, if you look at them, they're all the same. Especially if you're watching the same reactor. They're always impressed. They're always having their mind blown. They're always excited. And that didn't feel real to me. I wanted more of a dialogue about what I was taking in. And so on YouTube, I found Form of Therapy. PD does exactly what I needed them to do. PD has something called the Culture Study, where they watch music videos and break them down. And PD is Korean American, and they bring this amazing insight, both with their knowledge of film, but also their knowledge of Korean culture, because they were raised in Korea for a while. It was just nice to see a person who was honest about things that they didn't really like. And I realized, that is something I can do. I can be honest. And then the real impetus for creating this podcast was Hanson betrayed me. Or rather, Hanson failed me. I loved this group for 23 years. I grew up with this group. When I was a kid, I wanted to marry a member of this group. And then Hansongate happened. Basically, one of the members, my favorite member, was exposed as being racist, misogynistic, transphobic, basically everything that I'm against. That's what came out in this verified Pinterest account for Zach Hanson. And it broke my heart. It broke my heart because I dedicated 23 years to this group. It broke my heart because some of their music got me through really tough times. I have read about people in the LGBTQIA community who got through tough times listening to their music. And all of a sudden, it was there that 1/3 of this band not only didn't care about these people, he hated these people. And so it made me start to realize that I needed to really look at my relationships, my parasocial relationships with groups. And the issue just kept getting worse. And it got worse because fans were reaching out. Hanson has always been very open with their fans, or at least it seemed like they were open, because the fandom was so tight-knit and small. I'm not going to go through everything that happened in Hansongate. If you are interested, there is this great Reddit called Post Hanson, and they have a whole rundown of all of the grievances. But essentially, Black Hanson fans were asking for accountability, and instead of addressing what they were asking for, Hanson started deleting their comments. And that was a huge red flag. And they just kept being selfish. What they ended up doing was they had in-person concerts in, I believe it was October. They had in-person concerts, and they were getting all of this press, but none of the press was acknowledging that they were having these in-person concerts where people weren't wearing masks, where the members themselves were making fun of people who were wearing masks. It was a big problem. So they just keep shooting themselves in the foot. And I started this podcast because I realized I'd spent so much of my life. I spent 23 years of my life defending this group. Anytime I went out wearing a Hanson t-shirt, I was ready to fight. I was ready to have to explain it and go down and give my spiel about, were you nominated for a Grammy for a song that you helped write when you were 8 years old? No? Then you don't get to talk. And all of a sudden, this crumbled around me. And I realized I had started engaging with media in less of a parasocial way and more critically. And that's something I wanted to bring to K-pop, because that was something I was seeing when I was on social media and YouTube, that these fans, and they typically appear to be younger fans, were having the same fanatic approach. And I wanted to put something out there to help fans work through what they think and what they feel, especially because One day BTS isn't going to be big. One day there might be a scandal. People want to think that it will never happen. But just look at what happened a couple of weeks ago with Bobby from iKON. Bobby announced that he's engaged and his fiancée is giving birth this month. And people didn't know how to wrap their heads around that. And I wanted to be able to help people question what you're listening to and why you're enjoying it. And putting out my opinions and my insight as an older fan and being able to start a dialogue with other older fans and maybe have younger fans see things from another perspective. So that about sums it up. That is my origin story. A little bit more about who I am as a person and how I came to find K-pop and what caused me to make this podcast in the first place. And I would love to hear your origin stories. Go ahead and send them to me at unkpopularopinionspod@gmail.com. Thanks for listening, and as always, don't forget to keep questioning.